Merry Christmas, or rather a statistically average December 25th, which may or may not be of relevance to your time zone or belief system. Regardless, we proceed. Today's video has one small, insignificant Christmas detail hidden somewhere in the middle. You probably won't notice it or care, but it's there. This may be the most boring video ever made. Have you ever wondered how nothing became something, but then went back to being nothing? No? Well, you're about to find out anyway. We'll be exploring what poor people received for Christmas in the 1600s, which is to say, mostly nothing. But we'll take 2 hours to explain that nothing in excruciating detail. If you're expecting festive cheer, you've come to the wrong place. If you're expecting sleep, you've come to the right one. To understand what poor people got for Christmas in the 1600s, we must first understand what Christmas was, which is obvious. But we'll explain it anyway because that's what we do here. Before we begin our boring story, I want to let you know that our boring Christmas calendar is available in the pinned comment. At the end of this story, I will tell you why you should buy the best Christmas calendar ever created. Christmas, as you may have heard, celebrates the birth of Jesus Christ. This occurred approximately 2,000 years ago. Give or take a few years of calendar confusion that scholars continue to debate with the enthusiasm of people arguing about the optimal temperature for storing butter. The exact date is unknown, but December 25th was chosen by early Christians, possibly to coincide with existing pagan festivals, or possibly because they thought it sounded nice. Historical records are unclear. Much like everything else we'll discuss today, the Roman Empire, which existed from 27 BCE to 476 CE in the west and until 1453 CE in the east, though these dates are disputed by historians who have nothing better to do, initially persecuted Christians. Emperor Constantine I, also known as Constantine the Great, though great is relative, legalized Christianity in 313 CE with the Edict of Milan. This is important because, actually it's not important for our story at all. But we mentioned it, so here we are. By the 1600s, Christmas had evolved into a religious holiday celebrated across Christian Europe, though the manner of celebration varied significantly depending on your social class, geographical location, religious denomination, and access to food, which was often limited. The 1600s, for those keeping track, refers to the 17th century, spanning from 1601 to 1700. This may seem obvious, but many people confuse centuries with decades, much like how they confuse interesting content with whatever this is. The 17th century was characterized by several wars, including the 30 Years' War, 1618-1648, which was actually 30 years long, making it one of the few wars accurately named. There was also the English Civil War, 1642-1651, the Franco-Spanish War, 1635-1659, and various other conflicts that killed millions of people and reduced them to poverty, which is relevant to our topic, though we won't explain why for another 20 minutes. During this period, the majority of Europe's population lived in poverty. Poverty, for our purposes, is defined as having insufficient resources to maintain a basic standard of living. This included inadequate food, clothing, shelter, and access to what we might today call Christmas presents, though the concept of Christmas presents as we know them today didn't really exist yet. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The social structure of 17th century Europe was predominantly feudal, though feudalism was declining in some regions while persisting in others. At the top were kings and queens, followed by nobles, then various middle classes depending on your definition of middle, and at the bottom were peasants, serfs, and the urban poor. The poor, naturally, received the least of everything, including Christmas gifts, which brings us closer to our topic, though we'll take a detour first. Let's discuss the weather. The 17th century fell during what climatologists call the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that lasted from approximately 1300 to 1850, though some argue it began earlier and ended later because scholars love to argue about dates. This resulted in shorter growing seasons, crop failures, and increased poverty, particularly among those who were already poor, which is to say most people. The Little Ice Age affected different regions differently. In England, the Thames River froze solid multiple times, leading to frost fairs where people would set up markets and entertainment on the ice. This is mildly interesting, so we'll move on to something less interesting: food preservation during. The 1600s relied primarily on salting, smoking, drying, and keeping things very cold, which was easier during the Little Ice Age. Poor people, however, often lacked the resources for proper food preservation, meaning they ate what was available, when it was available, and went without when it wasn't. This is relevant to Christmas, because Christmas occurred during winter, when food was scarce, making Christmas gifts of food particularly valuable, though still rare. The average life expectancy in 17th century Europe was approximately 35 to 40 years, though this number is skewed by high infant mortality rates. If you survived to adulthood, you might live to 60 or beyond, assuming you weren't killed by war, disease, famine, or the various other hazards of medieval life. The poor generally had shorter lifespans than the wealthy, which is still true today, making it one of history's more consistent trends. Christianity in the 1600s was divided into several major branches: Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and various Protestant denominations that had emerged following the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Each had different traditions regarding Christmas, which affected what, if anything, poor people might receive during the holiday. Catholics, for instance, emphasized the religious aspects of Christmas, while some Protestant groups, particularly Puritans, viewed elaborate Christmas celebrations as frivolous or even sinful. The Puritans, who gained political power in England during the Civil War, actually banned Christmas celebrations from 1647 to 1660. This is ironic considering we're making a video about Christmas gifts during a period when Christmas was sometimes illegal. During the ban, Christmas was treated as a regular working day. Shops were required to stay open, and traditional Christmas foods were forbidden. Anyone caught celebrating could be fined or imprisoned, which certainly affected what poor people received for Christmas during those years: nothing and possibly a jail sentence. But let's step back further to the very concept of gift-giving itself. The tradition of giving gifts during winter celebrations predates Christianity, originating in various pagan traditions, including the Roman festival of Saturnalia, during which social norms were temporarily reversed and gifts were exchanged. Early Christians adapted this practice, connecting it to the gifts given to baby Jesus by the wise men, also known as the Magi, who brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh. These gifts were valuable, unlike what poor people received, which we'll eventually discuss. The wise men, incidentally, probably weren't wise men at all, but rather Persian priests or Zoroastrian magi, and they probably didn't arrive at Jesus' birth, but rather when he was a toddler, and there probably weren't three of them. But tradition has settled on 3 wise men, because that's how many gifts are mentioned in the Bible. This has no bearing on our story, but we thought you should know. Gift-giving traditions spread throughout Christian Europe over the centuries, but they were primarily practiced by the wealthy. The poor, by definition, had little to give and little expectation of receiving. This created a social dynamic where Christmas generosity flowed primarily from the rich to the slightly less rich, with occasional scraps reaching the genuinely poor, usually in the form of charity rather than gifts. Charity in the 1600s was often organized by the church, which collected tithes and donations from the faithful and distributed them to the poor, especially during religious holidays like Christmas. However, the amount of charity available was limited by the wealth of the local community, meaning that poor communities received less charity than wealthy communities, creating a system where the poor in wealthy areas were better off than the poor in poor areas. This is still true today, making it another of history's consistent trends. The concept of childhood as we understand it today didn't really exist in the 1600s. Children were often viewed as small adults and were expected to work from an early age. Poor children worked particularly hard because poor families needed every possible source of income. This meant that Christmas gifts for poor children were especially rare, as families prioritized survival over celebration. We should also discuss the calendar system in use during the 1600s, because why not? Most of Catholic Europe had adopted the Gregorian calendar, introduced by Pope Gregory XIII in 1582, while Protestant countries often continued using the Julian calendar. This meant that Christmas occurred on different dates in different countries, though the gifts received by poor people were equally meager, regardless of which calendar system was in use. The Julian calendar was approximately 11 days behind the Gregorian calendar by the 1600s, due to a small error in the calculation of leap years that accumulated over centuries. This discrepancy continued to grow, reaching 13 days by the 20th century, when most countries finally adopted the Gregorian system. England didn't switch until 1752, meaning that English poor people celebrated Christmas on a different day than French poor people, though this distinction was largely irrelevant given the similarity of their gifts. Transportation in the 1600s was slow and expensive, which limited the exchange of goods and ideas between regions. Most poor people lived their entire lives within a few miles of their birthplace, and their Christmas celebrations reflected local traditions and available resources. A poor person in England might receive a different type of meager Christmas gift than a poor person in France or Germany, though all would be united in their essential inadequacy. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, had begun to spread literacy throughout Europe by the 1600s, though literacy rates remained low, especially among the poor. This limited the exchange of ideas about Christmas traditions and gift-giving practices, meaning that many poor people celebrated Christmas according to oral traditions passed down through generations, which often bore little resemblance to the elaborate celebrations of the wealthy. Books were expensive in the 1600s, making them impractical gifts for poor people who often couldn't read anyway. Religious texts were somewhat more common as the church subsidized their production and distribution, but even these were often shared among entire communities rather than owned by individuals. A poor family might have access to a Bible or prayer book through their local church, but it would be unusual for them to own one. Medicine in the 1600s was primitive by modern standards, relying heavily on herbal remedies, bloodletting, and prayer. Poor people had limited access to medical care, and disease was a constant threat. This affected Christmas celebrations, as sick family members couldn't work and required care, reducing both the family's income and their ability to participate. In holiday activities, the plague periodically swept through Europe during the 1600s, killing millions and disrupting social and economic structures. During plague years, Christmas celebrations were often cancelled or severely limited, and poor people received even less than usual, which is saying something. We should also mention the role of guilds in 17th century society. Guilds were associations of craftsmen and merchants that controlled various trades and professions. They provided some social support for their members, including occasional charity during Christmas, but guild membership was expensive and often hereditary, excluding most poor people. Some guilds distributed leftover food or small gifts to the poor during Christmas, but this was voluntary and inconsistent. The agricultural calendar dominated life for most people in the 1600s, as the majority of the population worked in farming or related occupations. Christmas occurred during winter, when agricultural work was limited, which meant that farmers had more time for celebration but less money, as they wouldn't be paid again until the next harvest. This seasonal poverty affected Christmas gift-giving, particularly among rural poor people. Urban poor people faced different challenges, as they often worked in trades or services that continued throughout the winter. However, cold weather reduced demand for many services, and heating costs increased, living expenses, leaving little money for Christmas gifts. City poor people sometimes had access to charitable organizations that didn't exist in rural areas, but they also faced higher living costs and more competition for limited resources. The role of women in 17th century society was limited by law and custom. Women couldn't own property in most circumstances, couldn't vote, and had limited economic opportunities. Poor women were particularly disadvantaged, often working in domestic service or other low-paying occupations. This affected Christmas gift-giving within families, as women often had little money of their own to spend on gifts. Marriage in the 1600s was often an economic arrangement, particularly among the poor, who couldn't afford elaborate ceremonies or dowries. Christmas gifts between poor spouses were rare and practical, focusing on necessities rather than luxuries. A poor husband might give his wife a new needle or a small piece of cloth, while a poor wife might give her husband a mended shirt or a small portion of saved food. Children in poor families often worked from an early age, contributing to the family's income through various tasks appropriate to their size and strength. Child labor was not only legal but expected, and poor families relied on their children's earnings for survival. This meant that poor children had even less expectation of receiving Christmas gifts than poor adults, though they sometimes received small tokens or treats if the family's circumstances permitted. Education for poor children was limited or non-existent in the 1600s. Most could not read or write, and formal schooling was available only to the wealthy. This affected the transmission of Christmas traditions, which were passed down through oral tradition and practical example, rather than through written records. As a result, Christmas celebrations among the poor were often simplified versions of upper-class traditions, adapted to available resources. The concept of Santa Claus or Saint Nicholas existed in some form during the 1600s, though the modern version wouldn't emerge until much later. Saint Nicholas was a 4th century bishop known for his generosity to the poor, and he became associated with gift-giving in various European traditions. However, the St. Nicholas tradition was primarily celebrated in certain regions, particularly in Northern Europe, and even there, gifts were typically small and practical. In some areas, St. Nicholas was said to visit on December 6th, his feast day, rather than on Christmas Day. Children would leave out shoes or stockings, hoping to find small gifts or treats in the morning. Poor children might find a small piece of fruit, a nut, or a simple toy made from scraps of wood or cloth. Wealthy children received more elaborate gifts, creating an early example of economic inequality in holiday gift-giving. The Protestant Reformation had complex effects on Christmas traditions, as different Protestant denominations took varying approaches to holiday celebrations. Some embraced Christmas as a religious observance while rejecting what they saw as Catholic excesses, while others, like the Puritans, rejected Christmas celebrations entirely. This religious diversity affected what poor people received for Christmas, depending on their local religious authorities. In Catholic regions, Christmas was typically celebrated with religious services, special foods, and modest gift-giving among those who could afford it. The Church sometimes organized charitable distributions during Christmas, providing food or small gifts to the poor. However, these charitable efforts were limited by the resources available to local parishes, which were often poor themselves. Orthodox Christians, primarily in Eastern Europe and Russia, celebrated Christmas according to the Julian calendar, which placed the holiday 13 days later than in Western Europe. Orthodox Christmas traditions included special foods and religious services, but gift-giving was less emphasized than in Western traditions. Poor Orthodox Christians typically received little for Christmas beyond the spiritual benefits of religious observance. Trade routes in the 1600s were developing but still limited, which affected the availability of goods that might be given as gifts. Spices, for example, were expensive imports that only the wealthy could afford. Poor people's Christmas gifts were typically made from locally available materials, which varied significantly by region and season. The Little Ice Age, which we mentioned earlier, had specific effects on Christmas celebrations. Colder winters meant higher heating costs, which reduced the money available for gifts. However, frozen rivers and roads sometimes made transportation easier, allowing for more trade and communication between communities. This had mixed effects on Christmas gift-giving among the poor. Textile production in the 1600s was labor-intensive and expensive. Cloth was a valuable commodity, and new clothing was a luxury that most poor people couldn't afford. As a result, clothing items were among the most precious gifts that poor people might receive at Christmas. Though such gifts were rare, and usually consisted of mended or altered hand-me-downs rather than new garments. The production of simple toys and decorations was sometimes a winter activity for poor families, as agricultural work decreased during the cold months. Family members might carve wooden toys, sew simple dolls from scraps, or create decorations from natural materials. These homemade items sometimes served as Christmas gifts within the family, though they represented more time and effort than monetary value. Candles were expensive in the 1600s as they were made from tallow or beeswax, both of which required significant resources to produce. Food preservation and storage were constant concerns for poor families in the 1600s. Root cellars, smokehouses, and other storage facilities were investments that many poor families couldn't afford. This meant that food gifts at Christmas were often consumed immediately rather than saved, as families lacked the means to preserve perishable items. The brewing of beer and ale was common in 17th century Europe, as these beverages were often safer to drink than water, which was frequently contaminated. Poor families sometimes brewed their own alcohol using whatever grains they could afford, and sharing a cup of homemade ale or beer might constitute a Christmas gift among neighbors or family members. Religious holidays in the 1600s were often the only breaks from work that poor people received throughout the year. Christmas, along with Easter and a few other major holidays, provided rare opportunities for rest and celebration. Even without material gifts, this time off work was valuable to poor families, though they often couldn't afford to skip work entirely. The guild system, which we mentioned briefly earlier, sometimes provided support for poor widows and orphans of guild members. During Christmas, some guilds distributed small amounts of money or food to these dependents, though the amount was typically minimal and symbolic rather than substantial. Non-guild poor people received no such support. Wandering entertainers, including musicians, storytellers, and performers, sometimes visited communities during Christmas, providing free entertainment in exchange for food, shelter, or small donations. For poor people, this entertainment might be the closest thing to a Christmas gift they received, though the performers themselves were often poor as well. The legal system in 17th century Europe was harsh and often arbitrary. Poor people accused of crimes had little recourse and faced severe punishments for minor offenses. During Christmas, some authorities might show leniency or grant pardons, which could be considered a form of gift for those facing legal troubles, though such mercy was inconsistent and unreliable. Military service was often compulsory for poor, young men who had few alternatives to avoid conscription. Soldiers' families sometimes received small payments or provisions from military authorities, and these might be distributed during Christmas as a form of support. However, military pay was often delayed or reduced, making such gifts unreliable. The apprenticeship system provided some opportunities for poor young people to learn trades, though apprentices were often treated poorly and received minimal compensation. Masters sometimes gave their apprentices small gifts at Christmas, such as a new tool or a piece of clothing, though this was voluntary and depended on the master's generosity and financial situation. Seasonal labor patterns meant that many poor people worked intensively during harvest time, but had less work available during winter months. This created a cycle of relative prosperity, followed by relative poverty, with Christmas falling during the lean period when poor people had the least money for gifts or celebrations. The development of banking and credit systems in the 1600s primarily benefited wealthy merchants and landowners. Poor people had little access to credit and often relied on informal lending arrangements with neighbors or local merchants. These debts sometimes accumulated over the year and came due around Christmas, further reducing the resources available. For gift giving, international trade was expanding during the 1600s, but its benefits primarily flowed to wealthy merchants and investors. Poor people might see exotic goods in markets or hear stories about distant lands, but they had no access to imported luxuries that might serve as Christmas gifts. The concept of insurance was developing during this period, but it was available only to wealthy merchants protecting valuable shipments or property. Poor people had no protection against crop failures, fires, or other disasters that might destroy their limited possessions, making their economic situation particularly precarious around Christmas time. Now that we've established the basic historical context, which took 25 minutes and could have been summarized in 2 sentences, we can begin to examine the specific question of what poor people actually received for Christmas in the 1600s. But first, something unrelated. Let's discuss the etymology of the word gift. The word gift comes from the Old Norse gipt, meaning something given. This is related to the English word give, which comes from the Old English giffen. In German, the word is Geschenk, which comes from schenken, meaning to pour or to give. The French use cadeau, which comes from the Latin catena, originally meaning chain, though the connection to gift-giving is unclear and disputed by linguists who apparently have nothing better to do. The point is that the concept of giving has ancient linguistic roots, which doesn't help us understand what poor people got for Christmas in the 1600s, but we thought you should know anyway. Returning to our topic, the first thing to understand about Christmas gifts for poor people in the 1600s is that the concept of Christmas gifts as we know them today didn't really exist. Modern Christmas gift-giving is largely a product of 19th and 20th century commercial culture, influenced by literature like Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol and the development of department stores and mass production. In the 1600s, Christmas was primarily a religious holiday, and any exchange of gifts was secondary to religious observance. That said, some gift-giving did occur, even among the poor, though it was limited by practical constraints that we'll now examine in excruciating detail. The most common gifts that poor people might receive at Christmas were food items, though calling them gifts is somewhat generous, as they were often necessities shared within families or communities rather than luxuries given for pleasure. Let's examine these food gifts in the order of their likelihood, starting with the most common and working our way down to items so rare that calling them gifts for poor people is almost historical fiction. Bread was the most basic food staple in 17th century Europe, and a poor family might receive extra bread at Christmas if they were fortunate enough to live in a community with charitable institutions or generous neighbors. However, this bread was typically the same coarse dark bread that poor people ate throughout the year, made from whatever grains were available and affordable. Wheat bread was for the wealthy. Poor people ate bread made from rye, barley, oats, or even peas and beans when grain was scarce. The bread that poor people might receive as a Christmas gift was often stale, as fresh bread was expensive and spoiled quickly. Stale bread could be softened with water or broth to make it edible, or it could be used to make bread pudding if other ingredients were available, which they usually weren't. Sometimes, charitable organizations would distribute day-old bread from bakeries, which was still edible but no longer sellable to regular customers. Actually, let's pause here to discuss medieval bread making in detail, because this is apparently what we do now. Bread making in the 1600s was a time-consuming process that required access to grain, milling facilities, ovens, and fuel for heating. Poor people often lacked some or all of these resources, which is why they might receive bread as a gift rather than making their own. The process began with obtaining grain, which poor people typically bought in small quantities as they could afford it, rather than purchasing large amounts for storage. Grain had to be ground into flour, which required access to a mill. Mills were expensive to build and maintain, so they were typically owned by wealthy individuals or institutions who charged fees for their use. Poor people might have to travel considerable distances to reach a mill, and they had to pay the miller a portion of their grain as payment, further reducing their available food supply. Once flour was obtained, it had to be mixed with water and often with a leavening agent to make dough. Yeast was expensive and not always available, so poor people sometimes used sourdough starters, which were maintained over long periods and shared within communities. The dough then had to be kneaded, allowed to rise and shaped into loaves. Baking required access to an oven, which most poor people didn't have in their homes. Community ovens were sometimes available, often associated with mills or maintained by local authorities, but they required fuel and charged fees for their use. Poor people might have to wait in line for hours to use community ovens, and they risked having their bread burned or spoiled if the oven temperature wasn't properly controlled. The entire bread-making process, from obtaining grain to removing finished loaves from the oven, could take several days and required resources that many poor people couldn't afford. This is why receiving bread as a gift was meaningful, even if the bread itself was of poor quality by modern standards. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. let's return to other types of food that poor people might receive as Christmas gifts. Having spent an unreasonable amount of time discussing bread, ale and beer, as we mentioned earlier, were common beverages in 17th century Europe, often safer to drink. The brewing process was complex and required specific ingredients and equipment, making homemade ale a project that poor families might undertake collectively or with neighbors. Sharing the results of a brewing effort could constitute gift-giving within a community, though the ale itself was often of inconsistent quality and didn't keep well without proper storage facilities. Meat was a rare luxury for poor people in the 1600s, consumed primarily during special occasions like Christmas, harvest festivals or weddings. A poor family might receive a small portion of meat as a Christmas gift, though this was unusual and typically occurred only in communities with charitable institutions or unusually generous wealthy neighbors. The meat that poor people might receive was often of poor quality by modern standards, consisting of tough cuts from old animals or preserved meat that was somewhat past its prime. Fresh meat spoiled quickly without refrigeration, so any meat received as a gift had to be consumed immediately or preserved through smoking, salting or drying, processes that required additional resources and expertise. Poultry was sometimes more accessible to poor people than other types of meat, as chickens and geese could be raised in small spaces and fed on scraps and forage. A poor family might receive an egg or two as a Christmas gift, though eggs were valuable enough that they were often sold rather than consumed by the families that produced them. Actually, let's discuss poultry raising among poor people in the 1600s, because apparently that's where we're going with this. Keeping chickens required initial investment in birds, some form of shelter, and ongoing costs for feed when forage wasn't available. Poor people who kept chickens often had only 1 or 2 birds, which limited egg production and made the loss of a chicken to predators, disease or theft particularly devastating to the family's nutrition and income. Chickens in the 1600s were smaller and produced fewer eggs than modern breeds, and their egg production was seasonal, declining during winter months when daylight was limited and food was scarce. This made eggs particularly valuable during winter, which is when Christmas occurred, making them unlikely gifts for poor people who needed to sell them for income. Geese were sometimes kept by poor rural families as they could forage for much of their food and required less daily care than other livestock. However, geese were valuable enough that they were typically saved for special occasions or sold for income rather than consumed regularly. A poor family might eat goose at Christmas if they had raised one specifically for that purpose, though this represented a significant investment of time and resources. Ducks, swans, and other waterfowl were sometimes available to poor people who lived near rivers, lakes, or ponds, though hunting such birds often required permission from landowners and was subject to various legal restrictions that poor people might not be able to navigate successfully. Let's move on to vegetables, having thoroughly exhausted the topic of poultry among the 17th century poor. Vegetables that poor people might receive as Christmas gifts were typically root vegetables that could be stored through the winter: turnips, carrots, onions, and parsnips. These vegetables were hardy, nutritious, and could be kept for months in proper storage conditions, making them practical gifts that provided real nutritional value. However, proper storage conditions were often beyond the reach of poor families, who might lack root cellars, adequate containers, or the knowledge necessary to preserve vegetables effectively. A poor family might receive turnips as a Christmas gift, only to watch them spoil within days due to inadequate storage facilities. Cabbage was sometimes available to poor people, as it could be preserved through fermentation into sauerkraut, a process that required minimal resources and produced a food that would keep for months. However, fermentation required specific conditions and expertise that not all poor people possessed, and mistakes in the process could result in spoiled food, or even food poisoning. Dried peas and beans were valuable sources of protein for poor people and could be stored for long periods without spoilage. A poor family might receive a small quantity of dried legumes as a Christmas gift, though such gifts were rare because dried peas and beans were expensive and sought after by poor and wealthy alike. Herbs and spices were luxuries that poor people rarely possessed, making them particularly meaningful as gifts when they were available. A small amount of salt, pepper, or dried herbs could transform bland, monotonous meals into something approaching palatability, making such gifts valuable far beyond their monetary cost. Salt was especially valuable in the 1600s as it was essential for food preservation and was heavily taxed by many governments, making it expensive for poor people to obtain. A small quantity of salt as a Christmas gift could allow a poor family to preserve meat or vegetables that might otherwise spoil, extending their food supply through the winter months. But let's discuss salt production and taxation in 17th century Europe, because we haven't wasted enough time on tangential topics yet. Salt was produced through several methods in the 1600s: mining rock salt from underground deposits, evaporating seawater in coastal areas, and extracting salt from inland salt springs. Each method required significant labor and resources, making salt expensive to produce and transport. Rock salt mining was dangerous and labor-intensive, requiring workers to descend into deep mines and extract salt deposits using hand tools. The work was often done by poor people who had few other employment options, and mining accidents were common, though mine owners had little incentive to improve safety conditions. Seawater evaporation required large, shallow ponds where seawater could be allowed to evaporate, leaving salt crystals behind. This process was dependent on weather conditions and required considerable land area, making it feasible only in certain coastal locations with appropriate climate and geography. Salt. Springs were natural sources of salt water that could be evaporated to produce salt. These springs were valuable resources that were often controlled by wealthy landowners or government authorities, who charged high fees for access or operated salt production as monopolies. Governments throughout Europe imposed taxes on salt production and sales, as salt was a necessity that everyone had to purchase, making it a reliable source of tax revenue. These salt taxes, known as gabelle in France and similar names in other countries, significantly increased the cost of salt for consumers, particularly affecting poor people who spent a larger proportion of their income on necessities. The salt trade was international in scope, with different regions specializing in different production methods and exporting salt to areas where production was not feasible. This international trade was controlled by wealthy merchants and was subject to various tariffs and trade restrictions that further increased the cost of salt for end consumers. Salt was so valuable that it was sometimes used as currency or payment for wages, giving rise to the English word salary, which derives from the Latin word for salt. This historical connection between salt and payment illustrates the value placed on salt in pre-modern societies, making it a meaningful, if rare, Christmas gift for poor people. But we've spent far too much time discussing salt. Let's move on to non-food gifts that poor people might have received at Christmas, though we should note that non-food gifts were even rarer than food gifts, given the practical priorities of people living in poverty. Clothing items were among the most valuable non-food gifts that poor people might receive, though such gifts were unusual and typically consisted of used or repaired items rather than new garments. A poor person might receive a mended shirt, a patched pair of shoes, or a worn but serviceable cloak as a Christmas gift, though these items usually came from charitable organizations or wealthy neighbors rather than from other poor people. The production of clothing in the 1600s was time-consuming and expensive, requiring access to raw materials like wool, flax, or hemp, as well as the tools and skills necessary to process these materials into finished garments. Poor people often wore the same clothes for years, mending and patching them repeatedly until they fell apart completely. Shoes were particularly valuable as they protected feet from cold, wet, and rough surfaces, but they were also expensive and wore out quickly under heavy use. A poor person might receive a pair of used shoes as a Christmas gift, though finding shoes in the right size was often difficult, and poorly fitting shoes could cause more problems than going barefoot. Let's examine shoemaking in the 1600s because we're apparently committed to explaining every detail of 17th century life, regardless of relevance. Shoemaking required leather, which had to be obtained from slaughtered animals and processed through a lengthy tanning process that involved soaking hides in various chemicals and solutions. Tanning was a skilled trade that required specialized knowledge and equipment, making leather expensive and often of inconsistent quality. Different types of leather were used. Shoe repairs were a common service in 17th century communities, as replacing shoes was expensive and impractical for most people. Cobblers would patch holes, replace worn soles, and attempt to extend the life of footwear for as long as possible. A poor person might receive shoe repair services as a Christmas gift, though such services were typically paid for rather than given freely. Wooden shoes, called clogs or sabots, were sometimes worn by poor people in certain regions, as wood was cheaper than leather and more readily available. However, wooden shoes were uncomfortable, provided little protection from cold or wet conditions, and required specific woodworking skills to produce properly. The craft of wooden shoemaking involved selecting appropriate wood, usually poplar, willow or birch, carving the basic shape with specialized tools, and hollowing out the interior to accommodate human feet. This process required considerable skill and time, making wooden shoes less common than one might expect, despite their theoretical advantages for poor people. Tools were valuable possessions for poor people in the 1600s, as they enabled various forms of work and income generation. A poor person might receive a simple tool as a Christmas gift, a needle for sewing, a small knife for various tasks, or a basic carpenter's tool if they worked in construction or repair. However, quality tools were expensive and required skilled craftsmen to produce. Poor people often owned crude homemade tools that were less effective and wore out quickly. A well-made tool as a Christmas gift would be extraordinarily valuable, though such gifts were rare because good tools were expensive and sought after by craftsmen of all economic levels. Needles deserve special mention, as they were essential for clothing repair and construction, but were difficult to manufacture and expensive to purchase. A needle was small enough to be an affordable gift, yet valuable enough to be meaningful to a poor person who spent considerable time mending and altering clothing for their family. Needle-making in the 1600s was a specialized craft that required drawing wire through progressively smaller holes to achieve the proper thickness, then cutting, sharpening, and polishing individual needles. The process was labor-intensive and required specific materials and tools, making needles more expensive than their size might suggest. Pins were even smaller and less expensive than needles, but they served important functions in securing clothing and holding fabric pieces together during sewing. A small quantity of pins might be given as a Christmas gift to a poor woman, though pins were easily lost and needed frequent replacement. Thread for sewing was typically made from linen, wool, or hemp fibers that had to be spun into continuous strands. Poor people often made their own thread when possible, but purchasing ready-made thread saved considerable time and effort. A small amount of thread might be given as a Christmas gift, though it would be used up quickly in the constant process of clothing maintenance. Buttons were luxury items in the 1600s, as they required skilled craftsmen to produce, and were often made from expensive materials like metal, bone, or carved wood. Poor people's clothing was typically fastened with ties, laces, or simple toggles made from scraps of fabric or wood. A single button as a Christmas gift would be valuable, but also somewhat impractical, as poor people's clothing wasn't designed to accommodate buttons. Candles, which we mentioned earlier, were among the most practical gifts that poor people might receive at Christmas. A single candle could provide several hours of light for reading, sewing, or other activities that required vision, and candles could also provide symbolic significance during religious observances. Candle making required tallow or beeswax, both of which were expensive and often difficult to obtain. Tallow was rendered from animal fat, while beeswax came from bee colonies that had to be maintained and harvested. Both materials required processing and skill to produce quality candles, making candles valuable commodities rather than simple household items. Poor people sometimes made their own candles using whatever fat they could obtain, often producing crude, smoky candles that provided minimal light and unpleasant odors. A well-made candle from a professional chandler would be a significant improvement and a meaningful Christmas gift, though such gifts were uncommon. Soap was another practical item that poor people might receive as a Christmas gift, though soap was expensive and often considered a luxury rather than a necessity. Poor people typically washed with water alone, or used crude soap made from animal fat and wood ash, which was harsh and often ineffective. Commercial soap making required specific ingredients and knowledge of chemical processes that were not widely understood in the 1600s. Quality soap was produced by skilled craftsmen and was expensive enough that poor people often went without, making soap a valuable but impractical gift for someone living in poverty. Religious items constituted another category of potential Christmas gifts for poor people, though such items were typically simple and inexpensive rather than elaborate religious artwork or jewelry. A poor person might receive a small wooden cross, a simple religious medal, or a printed prayer card, though even these modest items represented some expense. Religious books were far too expensive for poor people to own, and most poor people couldn't read anyway, making books impractical as gifts. However, a poor person might receive access to religious services or ceremonies as a form of Christmas gift, though this stretches the definition of gift considerably. Pilgrim badges were sometimes available to poor people who made religious journeys to important shrines or holy sites. These badges served as proof of the pilgrimage and were worn as symbols of faith and devotion. However, pilgrimage required time and resources that poor people rarely possessed, making pilgrim badges uncommon among the genuinely impoverished. Rosary beads were used by Catholic poor people for prayer and meditation, but quality rosaries were expensive and often made from precious materials. Poor people might own crude rosaries made from carved wood or simple stone beads, and they might receive a replacement rosary as a Christmas gift if their existing one broke or wore out. Musical instruments were rarely owned by poor people in the 1600s, as even simple instruments required materials and craftsmanship that increased their cost beyond the reach of those living in poverty. However, a poor person might occasionally receive a simple instrument like a wooden flute or a small drum as a Christmas gift, though such gifts were unusual and impractical given other pressing needs. Entertainment and games were luxuries that poor people rarely enjoyed, as their time was typically devoted to survival-related activities. However, poor people might occasionally engage in simple games that required minimal equipment, and they might receive playing pieces or basic game materials as Christmas gifts, though such gifts were more symbolic than practical. Toys for poor children were extremely rare, as families struggling to provide food and shelter had little resources for non-essential items. Poor children typically played with objects they found or made themselves: sticks, stones, scraps of cloth, or carved pieces of wood. A simple wooden toy as a Christmas gift would be extraordinary for a poor child, though such gifts were uncommon. Doll making required materials and time that poor families often couldn't spare, though mothers sometimes created simple dolls from scraps of fabric stuffed with rags or straw. A handmade doll might be given as a Christmas gift to a poor child, representing considerable time and effort, even if the materials were essentially free. Books and written materials were completely impractical as gifts for poor people in the 1600s, as illiteracy was nearly universal among the poor, and books were expensive luxury items. Even simple printed materials like broadsheets or pamphlets were beyond the economic reach of poor people, who had more pressing needs for their limited resources. Money as a Christmas gift was virtually unknown among poor people, as poor people had no money to give, and wealthy people rarely gave money directly to poor people, preferring to provide charity in the form of food or other necessities. When poor people did receive money, it was usually in the form of wages for work performed, rather than gifts freely given. Services rather than material gifts sometimes constituted Christmas presents for poor people. A neighbor might offer to help with difficult tasks, share tools or equipment, or provide assistance with childcare or other domestic responsibilities. While these services had economic value, they were typically exchanges of labor rather than gifts in the modern sense. Medical care was expensive and often ineffective in the 1600s, making it an impractical gift for poor people who couldn't afford such services under normal. Fuel for heating was expensive and essential during winter months, making it a practical gift for poor people who often couldn't afford adequate heating. A poor family might receive a small quantity of wood, charcoal, or other combustible materials as a Christmas gift, though such gifts were usually small and consumed quickly. The gathering and processing of fuel required considerable time and effort, activities that poor people often couldn't pursue due to other survival-related obligations. Wealthy neighbors sometimes provided fuel as charity during winter months, though this was voluntary and inconsistent rather than a reliable source of heating materials. Transportation was expensive and often unnecessary for poor people who lived their entire lives within small geographic areas. However, a poor person might occasionally receive assistance with transportation costs as a Christmas gift, perhaps help paying for passage to visit distant family members or to travel for work. Opportunities. Animals as gifts were impractical for poor people who lacked the resources to feed and care for livestock. However, poor people might occasionally receive temporary use of animals for specific tasks, such as borrowing a horse or ox for plowing or transportation, though this was more likely to be a business arrangement than a Christmas gift. Storage. Containers and household items were valuable to poor people who often lacked adequate means of storing food, clothing, and other possessions. A poor family might receive a used basket, pot, or simple container as a Christmas gift, though such items were expensive enough that they were more likely to be shared or borrowed than given freely. Actually, let's examine household containers in 17th century poor households, because we haven't thoroughly exhausted any topic yet. Poor people in the 1600s owned very few household items, often limited to essential tools for food preparation and storage. Pots and pans were expensive, as they required metal that had to be mined, processed, and shaped by skilled craftsmen. Poor families often owned a single pot that served multiple purposes: cooking, storing, and sometimes even eating. Clay pots were less expensive than metal ones, but were fragile and broke easily, requiring frequent replacement. Poor people sometimes made their own clay containers, though this required access to suitable clay and knowledge of pottery techniques that not everyone possessed. Baskets were useful for carrying and storing various items, but basket making required specific materials like willow shoots or reeds, as well as the time and skill necessary to weave them properly. Poor people might make their own baskets when materials were available, though quality baskets required considerable expertise. Wooden containers like bowls and buckets were sometimes made by poor people themselves, though woodworking required tools and skills that not everyone had. A well-made wooden container could last for years with proper care, making it a valuable addition to a poor household's limited possessions. Cloth bags were used for storing grain, flour, and other dry goods, but cloth was expensive, and poor people often repurposed old clothing or other fabric items to create storage bags. A purpose-made storage bag would be a valuable gift for a poor family, though such items were costly enough to be impractical as casual gifts. We should also discuss the seasonal nature of poverty in the 1600s, as it affected both the need for gifts and the ability to provide them. Winter was typically the most difficult time for poor people, as agricultural work decreased, heating costs increased, and stored food supplies dwindled from the previous harvest. Christmas occurred during this difficult period, making gift-giving particularly challenging for poor people who were already struggling to meet basic needs. The irony is that Christmas gifts would have been most valuable during this time of greatest need, but least affordable for potential gift-givers who were themselves poor. Spring brought new opportunities for work and income as agricultural activities resumed and demand for various services increased. However, spring also brought the challenge of surviving until the next harvest, as stored food from the previous year was often exhausted and new crops were not yet ready. Summer was typically the most prosperous time for poor people, as agricultural work was plentiful and fresh food was available. However, summer earnings had to be saved for winter survival, leaving little excess for gift-giving or other non-essential expenses. Harvest time in autumn provided the best opportunity for poor people to earn money and accumulate resources for winter survival. However, the timing of harvest varied by crop and weather conditions, and poor harvests could mean starvation for families that depended on agricultural work. The cyclical nature of rural poverty meant that Christmas gifts for poor people were dependent on the success of the previous harvest and the severity of the winter. Good harvest years might allow for modest gift-giving, while poor harvest years meant that survival took precedence over celebration. Urban poor people faced different, seasonal challenges, as their work was less directly dependent on agricultural cycles. However, cold weather increased demand for fuel and warm clothing, while making many types of outdoor work more difficult or impossible, creating seasonal poverty patterns similar to those experienced by rural poor people. Now, after 50 minutes, of historical context that could have been summarized in a paragraph, we arrive at the moment you've all been waiting for. What did poor people actually receive for Christmas in the 1600s? The answer will surprise you. Actually, no, it won't. But we'll pretend it might. Are you ready for this revelation? Have you been taking notes, because what I'm about to tell you will fundamentally change your understanding of Christmas, poverty, and the human condition itself? Or it won't. But we'll spend the next 25 minutes building suspense anyway. Picture, if you will, a poor family in rural England in the year 1650. The father is a day laborer when work is available, which it often isn't during winter. The mother spins wool when she can obtain it, earning a few pence for thread that will be woven into cloth she'll never be able to afford. They have 3 children, ages 7, 9, and 11, all of whom work when possible, because child labor laws won't be invented for another 2 centuries. Christmas Eve approaches. Snow covers the ground, though snow in the Little Ice Age was different from modern snow. Colder, harsher, more likely to kill you if you weren't adequately prepared. Which this family isn't. They have no Christmas tree, because Christmas trees won't become popular in England for another 200 years. They have no Christmas stockings hanging by the fireplace, partly because Christmas stockings aren't a widespread tradition yet, and partly because they don't have a fireplace, just a crude hearth that fills their one-room dwelling with smoke. They have no Christmas cards, because Christmas cards won't be invented until the 1840s. They have no Christmas music playing, because they don't own any musical instruments and can't read music even if they did. They have no Christmas lights, because electric lights won't be invented for another 3 centuries, and even candles are too expensive for everyday use. So what do they have? What Christmas gift awaits this family that has spent the entire year on the edge of starvation? But before we reveal this earth-shattering information, let's discuss the philosophical implications of gift-giving among people who own nothing. The concept of giving implies having something to give. But what happens when you have nothing? Can you give nothing? Is nothing something? These are the questions that have puzzled philosophers for centuries, and they're particularly relevant to our discussion of Christmas gifts for poor people in the 1600s. Aristotle wrote about the virtue of generosity, but he was writing for an audience that owned property and had resources to share. What about people who own literally nothing beyond the clothes on their backs, and whose clothes are so worn and patched that they're barely functional? Medieval Christian philosophy emphasized charity and giving to the poor, but this assumed that there were wealthy people to do the giving and poor people to receive. What about communities where everyone was poor? Who gives to whom when everyone has nothing? The theological implications are fascinating. If God loves all people equally, why do some have resources to give while others have nothing to receive? Is poverty a test of faith? Is wealth a blessing or a curse? These questions become particularly acute during Christmas, a holiday celebrating the birth of someone who was himself born into poverty. But we're getting philosophical when you came here for historical facts. Let's return to our poor English family in 1650, shivering in their smoke-filled hovel on Christmas Eve. The children are hungry, as they have been for most of their lives. Chronic malnutrition has stunted their growth and weakened their immune systems, making them vulnerable to diseases that better-fed children might survive. They don't know this, of course, because nutritional science won't be developed for another 3 centuries. They just know they've been saving a small portion of their income for weeks, setting aside a halfpenny here and there, hoping to accumulate enough money for something special at Christmas. After 2 months of saving, they have accumulated the enormous sum of 4 pence. In modern terms, this represents perhaps $1 or 2 of purchasing power, though such comparisons are imprecise and misleading. What can you buy with 4 pence in 1650? A loaf of bread costs about 2 pence, though prices vary by region and season. A pint of ale costs about 1 pence. A candle costs about 1 pence. A needle costs about 1 pence. You see the pattern. 4 pence represents significant purchasing power for a family that normally has no purchasing power at all. But here's where the suspense builds. What will they choose to buy with their precious 4 pence? This decision will determine what Christmas gifts this poor family gives to themselves, because no one else is giving them anything. The father argues for bread, because bread is practical and will provide nutrition for several days. The mother argues for candles, because Christmas Eve should be illuminated, and they've been sitting in darkness for weeks to save money on lighting. The oldest child wants a piece of candy, because he's 11 years old and has never tasted sugar in his life. The discussion continues through Christmas Eve, because this is the most important financial decision the family will make all year. 4 pence might not sound like much, but for people who typically have no pence at all, it's a fortune that must be spent wisely. Meanwhile, in the manor house across the village, the local lord is preparing for his own Christmas celebration. He's planning a feast that will cost more than this poor family will earn in their entire lifetimes. He has multiple courses, exotic spices, imported wines, and entertainment that includes professional musicians and actors. The contrast is stark and intentional. Medieval society was built on inequality, and everyone understood their place in the social hierarchy. The poor didn't expect to live like the rich. They hoped only to survive long enough to see another Christmas. But back to our poor family and their 4 pence dilemma. Are you on the edge of your seat? Are you desperately wondering what they'll decide to buy because the answer is coming, and it's exactly as anticlimactic as everything else we've discussed? Actually, let's pause here to discuss the purchasing power of money in 17th century England, because we haven't spent nearly enough time on economic history. The English monetary system in 1650 was based on pounds, shillings, and pence, with 12 pence to a shilling and 20 shillings to a pound. This system was confusing even to people who used it daily, and it remained in use until decimal currency was introduced in 1971, making it one of history's most persistent examples of unnecessary complexity. Most poor people rarely handled money larger than pence, and many went entire lifetimes without seeing a pound coin. Their economic transactions were typically conducted in pence or through barter systems, where goods and services were exchanged directly without monetary intermediaries. Wage labor was becoming more common in the 1600s, but many poor people still worked under feudal arrangements, where they provided labor in exchange for land use rights protection and small payments in kind rather than cash wages. This meant that poor people often had limited experience with money and might not understand its relative value. Inflation was a constant concern in 17th century economies, though it operated differently than modern inflation due to the gold and silver standard and the limited nature of monetary systems. Poor people were particularly vulnerable to inflation because their wages were often fixed, while the cost of necessities like food and fuel fluctuated with market conditions. Regional variations in prices meant that 4 pence might buy different quantities of goods in different parts of England, and poor people often had limited knowledge of price variations because they rarely traveled beyond their immediate communities. Seasonal price variations were also significant, with food costs typically lowest during harvest time and highest during winter and spring, when stored supplies were scarce and fresh food was not yet available. Christmas occurred during the expensive season, making the 4 pence even more valuable. Currency debasement was a common practice by governments seeking to increase their money supply, and it affected the purchasing power of coins over time. Poor people were often unaware of these changes and might accept debased coins at face value, reducing their actual purchasing power. Counterfeiting was a serious problem in the 1600s, as coins were made from precious metals that could be clipped, filed or otherwise altered to extract value, while leaving coins that appeared legitimate. Poor people were particularly vulnerable to counterfeit coins because they often lacked the knowledge or tools to detect alterations. But enough about monetary systems. Let's return to our poor family and their momentous 4 pence decision, which is surely keeping you in suspense. The debate continues through the night. Should they buy bread and ensure several days of adequate nutrition? Should they buy candles and create a proper Christmas atmosphere? Should they indulge in the luxury of sugar candy and give their children a taste of sweetness they may never experience again? Or perhaps they should save the money for a future emergency, though emergencies are so common for poor people that saving money for emergencies is like saving umbrellas for rain. Theoretically sensible, but practically impossible when you need the resources immediately. The youngest child suggests they buy a needle because their clothes are falling apart, and their mother spends hours trying to repair them with a bent, dull needle that barely functions. This is practical thinking from a 7-year-old who has learned that survival trumps celebration in poor families. The middle child wants fabric scraps to make a doll because she's 9 years old and has never owned a toy of any kind. She's been playing with sticks and stones her entire life, and the idea of having an actual doll seems like the height of luxury. Each option represents a different philosophy of Christmas gift-giving: practical necessities versus symbolic luxuries, versus investment in future capabilities, versus pure indulgence in momentary pleasure. These are the same debates that wealthy families have about Christmas gifts, scaled down to a level where the total budget is 4 pence. The irony is that this poor family is spending more time and thought on their 4 pence Christmas budget than many wealthy families spend on Christmas budgets that are thousands of times larger. When resources are scarce, every decision becomes crucial. As Christmas Day dawns, the family finally reaches a decision. Are you ready for this revelation? Have you been holding your breath in anticipation? They decide to... But wait, let's examine one more aspect of 17th century poor life before revealing their choice. Decision-making processes in poor families were different from those in wealthy families, as poor families had fewer options and higher stakes for each choice. Every decision was potentially a matter of life and death, because poor families had no margin for error in their resource allocation. Wealthy families could afford to make mistakes in their Christmas gift choices. If they bought something impractical or unnecessary, they still had resources for necessities. Poor families couldn't afford any mistakes, making their decision-making processes more cautious and deliberative. The social dynamics within poor families were also affected by scarcity. Parents often sacrificed for their children, but children were also expected to contribute to family survival and might be required to sacrifice their own desires for family needs. The balance between individual wants and family survival was a constant tension. Gender roles in poor families were strictly defined but also practical. Men typically worked outside the home when work was available, while women managed household resources and childcare. However, everyone in a poor family, regardless of age or gender, was expected to contribute to survival efforts. Religious considerations also influenced decision-making, as poor people were often deeply religious and viewed their circumstances as part of God's plan. This could lead to acceptance of poverty as divinely ordained, but it could also inspire hope for divine intervention or reward in the afterlife. The concept of delayed gratification was both more important and more difficult for poor people than for wealthy ones. Poor people had to delay gratification constantly to survive, but they also had fewer opportunities to eventually satisfy delayed desires, making the psychological burden more intense. All of these factors influenced our poor family's 4 pence Christmas decision. The stakes were high, the options were limited, and the consequences would affect their survival through the winter. So what did they choose? This is what Christmas looked like for poor people in the 1600s, the extraordinary luxury of having enough food for 3 consecutive days. The Christmas miracle was not going to bed hungry on December 25th, and that, dear viewers, is the climactic revelation you've been waiting for. Poor people got bread for Christmas sometimes if they were lucky, if they had saved money, if bread was available, if they could afford it. Are you satisfied with this earth-shattering conclusion? Does this meet your expectations for a dramatic revelation? Because this is as exciting as Christmas for poor people. God, in the 1600s. But wait, we're only halfway through this video and we've already revealed the main point. What could we possibly discuss for another hour and 15 minutes? Everything. We'll discuss everything in painful detail because that's what we do here. We'll examine every aspect of this bread purchase, analyze its implications, and explore tangential topics until you're either asleep or questioning your life choices. Are you still watching? If so, why? What compels you to continue listening to this deliberately boring narrative about something as mundane as poor people buying bread for Christmas in the 1600s? These are existential questions that we'll explore in the next section, which will be even more tedious than this one. Subscribe if you're still awake, or don't. It changes nothing. Now that we've revealed the stunning climax, poor people got bread for Christmas. Let's examine this revelation with the thoroughness it doesn't deserve. We'll spend the next 25 minutes dissecting every aspect of this bread purchase, because apparently that's what passes for entertainment in this corner of YouTube. Let's start with the bread itself. Not just any bread, but the specific type of bread that poor people could afford with their precious 4p in 1650s England. This wasn't the fluffy white bread that modern people take for granted, nor was it the artisanal sourdough that hipsters pay premium prices for today. This was survival bread, made from whatever grains were available and affordable, baked by people who prioritized nutrition over flavor. The wheat used in poor people's bread was often mixed with other grains to reduce costs and increase volume. Barley, oats, rye, and even peas or beans might be ground up and added to wheat flour, creating a dense, heavy loaf that provided maximum calories per pence spent. The resulting bread was dark, coarse, and often difficult to chew, but it kept people alive, which was the primary consideration. Let's examine the grinding process for these mixed grains, because we haven't spent nearly enough time on medieval food preparation techniques. Grain grinding in the 1600s was performed at mills, powered by water or wind, though hand grinding was sometimes done for small quantities. The millstones were massive pieces of stone, carefully carved and maintained to produce consistent flour. However, the quality of grinding varied significantly depending on the mill's condition and the miller's skill. Poor people often received flour that was coarsely ground, as fine grinding took longer and cost more. Coarse flour produced bread with a gritty texture that was difficult to chew and digest, but it was cheaper and still provided nutritional value. The bran and other grain components that would be removed from fine flour were left in poor people's flour, actually making their bread more nutritious by modern standards, though less palatable. Stone particles from the millstones sometimes mixed with the flour during grinding, adding an unwelcome mineral content to the bread. These stone particles could damage teeth and cause digestive problems, but poor people had little choice but to accept whatever flour they could afford. The miller typically kept a portion of each customer's grain as payment for grinding services, a practice known as multure. This reduced the amount of flour that poor people received from their grain, making their bread even more precious. Millers were often suspected of taking more than their fair share, leading to tensions between millers and their customers. Grain quality varied significantly depending on growing conditions, harvest timing, and storage methods. Poor people often purchased lower quality grain that wealthier customers had rejected, grain that might be partially spoiled, infested with insects, or contaminated with weeds and other materials. The bread made from this flour was baked in communal ovens, as individual households rarely had their own ovens. Poor people would bring their shaped loaves to the community oven and pay a fee for baking services. The oven temperature was difficult to control, and bread might be undercooked, overcooked, or unevenly baked, depending on its position in the oven and the skill of the baker. Oven scheduling was often a source of conflict, as everyone wanted to bake their bread when the oven was at optimal temperature. Poor people might have to accept less desirable baking times, resulting in bread that was of lower quality than what wealthier customers produced. The fuel used to heat community ovens was expensive, and the cost was passed on to customers through baking fees. Poor people sometimes couldn't afford these fees and might attempt to bake bread over open fires, with predictably poor results. Bread baked over fires was often burned on the outside and raw on the inside, but it was still better than no bread at all. Bread preservation was a constant challenge, as bread spoiled quickly without preservatives or proper storage. Poor people often ate stale or partially moldy bread because they couldn't afford to waste food, even food that was no longer appetizing or entirely safe to eat. The 2 loaves of bread that our poor family purchased for Christmas would have been consumed within days of purchase, as they lacked the storage facilities to keep bread fresh for extended periods. The family would eat the bread while it was still relatively fresh, savoring what was for them an unusual abundance of food. But let's examine the social and psychological aspects of this bread purchase, because the economic and practical aspects apparently weren't boring enough. The act of purchasing bread specifically for Christmas represented a break from the family's normal subsistence patterns. Throughout the year, they ate whatever food was available when it was available, often going without meals when no food or money was available. The Christmas bread purchase was a deliberate choice to ensure adequate food during a specific time period, a luxury that they couldn't afford during most of the year. This planning ahead represented a form of celebration in itself. The family was able to anticipate Christmas and prepare for it, rather than simply hoping they would survive to see December 25th. The bread purchase was evidence that they had successfully saved money over several months, demonstrating financial discipline that was necessary for survival but difficult to maintain under constant economic pressure. The psychological impact of having guaranteed food for 3 days cannot be underestimated for people who normally lived meal to meal. The Christmas bread provided not just nutrition, but also peace of mind, allowing the family to focus on religious observance and family togetherness without the constant worry about where their next meal would come from. However, this temporary security also highlighted the family's normal insecurity. The contrast between Christmas abundance, 2 loaves of bread, and normal scarcity, whatever they could find or afford each day, made their usual poverty more apparent and perhaps more difficult to bear after Christmas had passed. The children's reaction to the Christmas bread would have been complex. On one hand, they would be pleased to have adequate food, and might even consider bread a special treat if they were accustomed to going without meals. On the other hand, they might have been disappointed that the family's entire Christmas celebration consisted of bread, especially if they were aware of how wealthy families celebrated Christmas. The parents' emotions would have been similarly complex. Pride in their ability to provide Christmas bread for their family might be mixed with sadness that bread represented the extent of their Christmas generosity to their children. The knowledge that other families were enjoying elaborate feasts while they celebrated with simple bread might have been painful, though such comparisons were part of daily life for poor people in a rigidly hierarchical society. Religious considerations would have influenced how the family viewed their Christmas bread. Christian teaching emphasized spiritual rather than material wealth, and the family might have found comfort in the knowledge that Jesus himself was born into poverty and would have understood their circumstances. The bread might have had symbolic significance beyond its nutritional value, representing the bread of communion and God's provision for the faithful. However, religious teaching also emphasized charity and care for the poor, and the family might have wondered why God's provision was so meager when they were faithful believers. The theological implications of poverty during a religious holiday celebrating God's love for humanity could be troubling for people who were struggling to survive despite their faith. The timing of the bread purchase would have required careful planning, as bread was baked on specific days and had to be purchased when it was fresh. The family would need to coordinate their savings, their work schedules, and the baker's schedule to ensure they could purchase bread at the optimal time. For Christmas, market days varied by community, and poor people often had to travel considerable distances to reach markets where bread was sold. The cost of transportation to market might eat into the money available for bread, reducing the amount they could purchase or requiring them to buy lower quality bread that was available locally. Seasonal variations in bread availability and prices would have affected the family's Christmas bread purchase. Winter bread was often more expensive than summer bread, as grain supplies dwindled and heating costs for ovens increased. The family might have had to settle for less bread or lower quality bread than they would have preferred. Competition from other poor families seeking Christmas bread might have affected availability and prices. If many families in the community had the same idea of purchasing special bread for Christmas, increased demand might have driven up prices or led to shortages that left some families without bread at all. The bread purchase represented a significant portion of the family's annual discretionary spending. For most of the year, all of their income went to immediate survival needs: shelter, basic food, essential clothing repairs, and unavoidable expenses. The Christmas bread represented one of the few times during the year when they could choose to spend money on something beyond immediate necessity. This discretionary spending would have felt both liberating and frightening. The freedom to choose how to spend money was unusual for people who normally had no choices about their purchases, but the knowledge that they were spending money they could ill afford would have created anxiety about future financial security. The families, neighbors, and community members would have been aware of their Christmas bread purchase, as economic transactions in small communities were often public knowledge. Other poor families might have felt envious of their ability to afford Christmas bread, while the family might have felt guilty about their relative prosperity compared to neighbors who couldn't afford any special Christmas provisions. Social dynamics within poor communities were complicated by these small differences in economic status. Families that could afford Christmas bread might be viewed as slightly better off than their neighbors, even though all were living in poverty by objective standards. These minor distinctions could create tensions and jealousies that persisted long after Christmas had passed. The sharing of Christmas bread within the community might have been expected or demanded by social conventions. Poor communities often operated on principles of mutual support, where families that had resources were expected to share with those who didn't. Our poor family might have felt obligated to share their precious bread with neighbors who had nothing, reducing their own Christmas celebration while fulfilling social obligations. Alternatively, they might have chosen to consume their bread privately to avoid requests for sharing, though such selfishness would have been noted by neighbors and could have affected their standing in the community. The decision of whether to share Christmas bread represented another difficult choice for people who had few resources and many competing demands. Let's examine the actual consumption of this Christmas bread, because we apparently need to analyze every aspect of this mundane transaction. The family would have planned their bread consumption carefully to maximize both nutrition and pleasure. Eating 2 loaves of bread over 3 days required strategic thinking about meal timing, portion sizes, and preservation of remaining bread between meals. Fresh bread was best consumed immediately after purchase, when it was still soft and flavorful. However, eating all the bread at once would have left the family without food for the remainder of Christmas and the following days. The temptation to overconsume when food was temporarily abundant would have been strong, particularly for children who were accustomed to chronic hunger. The parents would have had to enforce discipline in bread consumption, ensuring that the bread lasted for the planned 3 days, while allowing family members to feel adequately fed during Christmas. This required careful measurement of portions and firm enforcement of eating schedules, turning what should have been a celebration into another exercise in survival management. Bread preservation during consumption required storing partially eaten loaves in ways that minimize spoilage, while maintaining accessibility for meals. Poor families often lacked adequate storage containers, so bread might have been wrapped in cloth, stored in baskets, or simply placed on clean surfaces where it would be protected from dirt and pests. The quality of bread deteriorated rapidly after baking, becoming stale, hard, and increasingly difficult to chew. Poor families had techniques for making stale bread more palatable, soaking it in water or broth, toasting it over fires, or crumbling it into soups or gruels. These techniques allowed them to consume bread that would be considered inedible by wealthier families. Mold growth on bread was a constant concern, particularly during damp winter weather when humidity encouraged fungal growth. Poor families often ate bread that showed early signs of mold, as they couldn't afford to waste food, though consuming moldy bread posed health risks that they might not have understood. The nutritional value of the Christmas bread would have been significant for family members who were chronically undernourished. 2 loaves of bread provided carbohydrates, some protein, B vitamins, and other nutrients that were often lacking in the poor people's diets. The temporary improvement in nutrition might have had noticeable effects on energy levels and general health. However, the psychological effects of adequate food might have been even more significant than the nutritional benefits. The sense of fullness and satisfaction that came from eating enough bread would have been unusual and memorable for family members who normally experienced constant hunger. The contrast between Christmas abundance and post-Christmas scarcity would have been stark and potentially demoralizing. After 3 days of adequate food, returning to the normal pattern of uncertain meals and chronic hunger might have been more difficult to bear than it was before the Christmas bread purchase. The memory of Christmas bread would have sustained the family emotionally throughout the following year, providing evidence that improved circumstances were possible and giving them something to anticipate for the next Christmas. This hope might have been crucial for psychological survival during the most difficult months of winter and spring. But let's also consider what didn't happen during this Christmas bread celebration, because absence is as significant as presence. In understanding historical experiences, there was no Christmas dinner in the modern sense, with multiple courses, special recipes, and elaborate preparation. The bread was the entire Christmas meal, consumed with whatever other minimal food the family had available, perhaps water, weak ale if they were fortunate, or thin gruel made from scraps. There were no Christmas gifts exchanged between family members, as the bread purchase represented the family's entire discretionary spending for the holiday. Children didn't receive toys, games, or special treats beyond their share of the bread. Parents didn't exchange tokens of affection or appreciation. There was no Christmas decoration of their dwelling, as decorative materials cost money that the family couldn't afford to spend on non-essential items. No greenery, no candles for atmosphere, no special arrangements of their few possessions to create a festive environment. There was no Christmas entertainment in the form of music, stories, or games that required special materials or equipment. The family's Christmas celebration consisted of eating bread and perhaps attending religious services if such services were available and accessible. There was no Christmas hospitality extended to neighbors, friends, or relatives, as the family lacked the resources to entertain guests or provide food for others. Their Christmas was necessarily private and isolated, focused on their own survival rather than community celebration. There was no Christmas travel to visit distant family members, as transportation was expensive and time away from potential work meant lost income that the family couldn't afford. Christmas was spent wherever the family normally lived, without the excitement of new places or reunion with distant relatives. There was no Christmas charity extended to others who were less fortunate, as the family was itself among the least fortunate members of their community. They were recipients of charity when it was available, but they had nothing to give to others who might be in need. The absence of these elements that modern people associate with Christmas celebrations highlights the stark differences between historical and contemporary Christmas experiences. What we consider essential components of Christmas were luxuries far beyond the reach of poor people in the 1600s. Yet the family's Christmas bread celebration was still meaningful within their context. The ability to plan ahead, save money, and purchase special food for a religious holiday represented significant achievement for people living in extreme poverty. Their modest celebration was proportional to their resources and appropriate to their circumstances. The religious significance of Christmas remained intact despite the absence of material celebration. The family could still observe the spiritual aspects of the holiday, attend religious services if available, and reflect on the Christian message of hope and salvation. The bread itself might have reminded them of the bread of communion and Jesus' teaching about daily bread in the Lord's Prayer. The family solidarity demonstrated by their collective saving effort and shared Christmas bread consumption represented important social and emotional values that didn't require material wealth. Working together toward a common goal, making sacrifices for shared benefits, and celebrating modest achievements were meaningful experiences regardless of their economic circumstances. Now, if you've made it this far in this video, you're either asleep, hypnotized, or questioning your life choices. We're 1 hour and 40 minutes into a 2-hour video about what poor people got for Christmas in the 1600s, and we've established that they got bread. Sometimes, if they were lucky, this level of detail about bread consumption might seem excessive, but it reflects the reality that for poor people in the 1600s, every decision about food was significant and worth careful consideration. What seems trivial to modern viewers was literally a matter of life and death for people living in historical poverty. If you're one of the 7 people still watching, comment Emperor Blandicus below. Or don't. Your choice won't affect the historical reality of 17th century poverty. We still have 20 minutes left in this video, which we'll use to explore the existential implications of everything we've just discussed. Because apparently we haven't been thorough enough yet, we've now spent 1 hour and 40 minutes discussing what poor people received for Christmas in the 1600s, and the answer is bread. Sometimes. If they saved money for months. If bread was available. If they could afford it. This information will not change your life, improve your circumstances, or make you a more interesting person at parties. You might wonder why you're still watching this video. You might question the decisions that led you to spend nearly 2 hours of your finite existence learning about historical bread consumption patterns. These are valid questions that we won't answer, because we don't know why you're still here either. This part of the story is being told solely to reach our time target of 2 hours. We could have conveyed the essential information about poor people's Christmas gifts in the 1600s in approximately 3 minutes. They were poor, it was the 1600s. They got almost nothing, sometimes they got bread. Everything else has been elaborate padding designed to transform 3 minutes of content into 120 minutes of video. The irony is that by acknowledging this padding, we're engaging in meta-commentary that is itself padding. We're discussing the fact that we're wasting your time, which wastes even more of your time. It's padding about padding, like a Russian nesting doll of irrelevance. But perhaps there's something profound about spending 2 hours on something so mundane. In our modern world of constant stimulation and rapid information consumption, there's something almost radical about slowing down to examine a single historical bread purchase in excruciating detail. You're experiencing the opposite of modern media consumption patterns, which might be therapeutic or maddening, depending on your perspective. The poor family we've been following would have spent far less time thinking about their bread purchase than we've spent analyzing it. For them, it was a practical decision made quickly out of necessity. They didn't have the luxury of extended contemplation about their choices, because survival required immediate action and constant vigilance. The fact that we can spend 2 hours discussing their bread while they spent perhaps 10 minutes deciding to buy it represents a fundamental difference between historical survival and modern leisure. We have enough resources to waste time analyzing other people's survival decisions, which would have been incomprehensible to people whose every moment was devoted to staying alive. This raises philosophical questions about the relationship between historical subjects and modern observers. Are we honoring the memory of poor people by examining their experiences in detail, or are we trivializing their struggles by turning their survival strategies into entertainment content? The answer probably depends on your perspective and your reasons for watching this video. The poor family in our story lived and died without knowing that anyone would remember their Christmas bread purchase or spend 2 hours analyzing its implications. Their experience was immediate, personal, and unrecorded by official history, which focused on the activities of wealthy and powerful people rather than the survival strategies of the poor. Yet their experience was shared by millions of people throughout history who lived in poverty and celebrated Christmas with whatever meager resources they could accumulate. Our fictional family represents countless real families whose stories were never recorded, but whose experiences shaped the historical reality of Christmas celebrations among the poor. The universality of their experience, working constantly, saving when possible, making difficult choices about resource allocation, celebrating modestly within their means, connects them to poor people throughout history and around the world today. Poverty creates similar survival patterns, regardless of time period or geographical location. This connection between historical and contemporary poverty raises uncomfortable questions about social progress and economic inequality. Have we really eliminated the conditions that forced our fictional family to celebrate Christmas with bread? Or have we simply moved those conditions to different geographical locations or made them less visible to middle-class observers? Modern poor people might have access to government assistance programs, charitable organizations, and social services that didn't exist in the 1600s, but they still face choices about resource allocation that would be familiar to our historical family. The specific goods and services available might be different, but the underlying economic constraints are similar. The romanticization of historical poverty in popular culture often glosses over the harsh realities of survival that we've been examining. Christmas stories about poor but happy families who find joy in simple pleasures tend to ignore the constant stress, chronic hunger, and premature death that characterized historical poverty. Our detailed examination of the bread purchase reveals the mundane reality behind romanticized poverty narratives. There was nothing heartwarming or inspiring about a family's entire Christmas celebration, consisting of 2 loaves of bread consumed over 3 days. It was simply the best they could do with extremely limited resources. The fact that they made the effort to save money and plan for Christmas despite their circumstances might be admirable, but it was also necessary for psychological survival. Human beings need hope and meaning to sustain themselves through difficult circumstances, and Christmas provided a framework for both. Religious faith probably played a crucial role in helping poor people cope with their circumstances, providing both explanation for their suffering and hope for eventual relief. The Christian message of salvation and eternal life offered compensation for temporal poverty that made current hardships more bearable. However, religion could also be used to justify existing social inequalities and discourage poor people from seeking to improve their circumstances. The emphasis on spiritual rather than material wealth might have encouraged acceptance of poverty as God's will rather than as a social problem requiring solutions. The relationship between individual responsibility and social circumstances becomes complex when examining historical poverty. Our poor family worked hard, made sacrifices, and planned carefully for Christmas, demonstrating personal responsibility and moral virtue. Yet their circumstances were largely determined by social and economic structures beyond their control. Modern debates about poverty often focus on individual versus systemic causes, but historical examples like our family's Christmas bread purchase suggest that both factors were important. Individual choices mattered within constrained circumstances, but those circumstances were shaped by broader social and economic systems. The intellectual exercise of analyzing historical poverty in such detail might seem pointless, but it serves several purposes. It humanizes historical experiences that are often reduced to statistics or generalizations. It reveals the complexity of survival strategies that might appear simple from a distance. It challenges assumptions about historical periods that we might otherwise romanticize or oversimplify. It also provides perspective on modern complaints about Christmas commercialism, gift-giving obligations, and holiday stress. Our contemporary Christmas problems, deciding how much to spend, choosing appropriate gifts, managing family expectations, would be incomprehensible to people whose Christmas challenge was accumulating enough money to buy bread. The contrast between historical and modern Christmas experiences. This doesn't mean that modern problems are insignificant or that we should be satisfied with current conditions, because they're better than historical alternatives. Progress creates new possibilities and new challenges, and each generation must address the problems of its own time. But it does suggest that historical perspective can be valuable in understanding our current circumstances and priorities. The detailed examination of how poor people celebrated Christmas in the 1600s provides context for evaluating modern Christmas traditions and their significance. The time you've spent watching this video, nearly 2 hours, represents a form of leisure that was unavailable to our historical family, who couldn't afford to spend time on activities that didn't contribute directly to survival. Your ability to waste time on deliberately boring content is itself a form of privilege that most humans throughout history couldn't afford. This raises questions about how we choose to use our leisure time and whether consuming content about historical poverty is a worthwhile use of resources that poor people throughout history would have envied? There's no clear answer to this question, but it's worth considering as we conclude our exhaustive examination of Christmas bread. If you've made it this far, you clearly need a hobby. Consider subscribing, though we can't promise that our other videos will be any more interesting than this one. In fact, we can almost guarantee they won't be. We have 5 minutes left to fill, which we'll use to reveal that one small, insignificant Christmas detail we promised at the beginning of this video. Remember, you probably don't, because it was nearly 2 hours ago, and very little has happened since then. The hidden Christmas detail we mentioned at the beginning of this video was the bakery that sold bread to our poor family was operated by a man named Noel Baker. His first name was Noel, which means Christmas in French, though he probably didn't know that because he was an illiterate English baker in the 1600s who spoke no French and had never heard of etymology. This detail is so insignificant that you probably didn't notice we hadn't mentioned it yet. The baker's name has no bearing on the story, adds no meaningful information to our analysis, and exists solely to fulfill our promise of including a Christmas detail somewhere in the middle of the video. Noel Baker baked bread every Tuesday and Friday, using standard recipes and techniques that were indistinguishable from those used by other bakers in similar communities throughout England. He charged standard prices, maintained average quality standards, and lived an entirely unremarkable life that ended when he died of fever at age 43, leaving behind a widow and 2 children who sold the bakery to pay his debts. The fact that a baker named Noel sold Christmas bread to poor people is the kind of minor historical irony that might seem meaningful if you're looking for meaning in meaningless details. But it's not meaningful. It's just a coincidence if it even happened, which it probably didn't because we made up the entire story of the poor family and their Christmas bread purchase. Did you think this was real history? Did you believe we had specific records of individual poor families and their Christmas gift purchases from the 1600s? Of course we don't. Historical records from that period focused on wealthy and powerful people, not on impoverished families buying bread for Christmas. The story of the family saving 4 pence to buy 2 loaves of bread for Christmas was a composite narrative based on general knowledge of historical poverty, economic conditions, and social structures in 17th century England. The specific details were invented to illustrate broader historical realities, not to recount actual events. This revelation doesn't invalidate our analysis of historical poverty and Christmas celebrations among the poor. The general conditions we described were accurate, and poor families throughout the 1600s did face the kinds of challenges and choices we examined. We simply created a specific example to make abstract historical concepts more concrete and relatable. The educational value of our analysis remains intact, even if the specific family was fictional. Understanding historical poverty requires imagination and empathy to bridge the gap between abstract knowledge and lived experience, and fictional narratives can serve that purpose when used responsibly. But the fact that you've spent 2 hours listening to detailed analysis of a fictional bread purchase raises additional questions about the nature of educational content, entertainment, and the use of time in modern society. These questions are left as an exercise for the viewer. Now, before we conclude this epic journey into historical boredom, I have something special for you, something that perfectly captures the spirit of what we've just experienced together. Introducing the boring Christmas calendar featuring our beloved character, Sleepsy Noel. This isn't just any calendar. It's a limited-time collection of 31 days of the most wonderfully mundane Christmas expressions you've ever seen. Each day reveals a new, delightfully boring expression from Sleepsy Noel, designed to bring the same soothing, sleep-inducing calm that you've just experienced in this video. From mildly festive Tuesday to moderately Yuletide Wednesday, every single day is an exercise in comfortable tedium. Picture this: waking up each morning to discover what uninspiring Christmas sentiment awaits you. Day 15 might feature Sleepsy Noel saying Christmas approaches with statistical inevitability. Day 23 could showcase the holiday occurs regardless of preparation levels. Each expression is carefully crafted to be exactly as thrilling as watching paint dry on Christmas Eve. This calendar is available for a limited time only because even boring things must create artificial scarcity to maintain interest. You'll find the link pinned in the comments below, probably right next to comments from people questioning their life choices after watching this entire video. Why would you want this calendar? Well, if you've made it this far through our exhaustive analysis of historical bread consumption, you've clearly developed an appreciation for the finer points of tedium. This calendar is the perfect way to extend that appreciation throughout an entire month of Christmas season. And so we reach the end of our 2-hour journey into the Christmas experiences of poor people in the 1600s. We've learned that they occasionally received bread, sometimes bought bread for themselves, and generally had Christmas experiences that were far less interesting than modern Christmas celebrations. That, dear viewer, is how poor people in 17th century England celebrated Christmas. With bread, if they were fortunate, and with nothing if they weren't. This information will not change your life, improve your financial situation, or make you more popular at parties. If you're still here, you've demonstrated a remarkable commitment to pointless information and deliberate boredom. This makes you part of the 0.01% of humanity that completed this video, which is either an achievement or a concerning indication of how you choose to spend your time. The meta loop we opened at the beginning is now closed. You've discovered the insignificant Christmas detail, learned about historical bread purchases, and experienced 2 hours of deliberately tedious content. You may now return to your regularly scheduled life with the knowledge that you've survived something that was designed to be survivable only by the most determined viewers. Don't forget to check out the boring Christmas calendar in the comments. It's the perfect way to extend this experience for an entire month, because apparently you enjoy this sort of thing. Subscribe if you want more content like this, though we can't imagine why you would. Until next time, remember that history is full of boring details that most people wisely ignore. The end. Oh, and one more thing. That boring Christmas calendar featuring Sleepsy Noel. It's not just boring, it's revolutionarily boring. Each day doesn't just give you a mundane Christmas expression, it gives you a masterclass in how to find contentment in the ordinary. Think about it. In a world of constant stimulation and manufactured excitement, isn't there something deeply satisfying about embracing the beautifully boring? Sleepsy Noel understands this. That's why each calendar day is designed to slow down your morning routine, help you appreciate the unremarkable, and find peace in predictability. Day 7. Christmas. Cookies will be consumed at statistically average rates. Day 18. Gift wrapping occurs with varying degrees of competence. Day 25. Christmas arrives punctually as scheduled. This is the kind of profound mundanity that money can't buy, except it can buy it. And you should, because this limited time calendar won't be available forever. Check the pinned comment for your link to 31 days of beautiful boredom with Sleepsy Noel. Because if you've watched this entire video, you've already proven you have exquisite taste in tedium.